If you don't trust the news anymore, you don't trust your politicians anymore. And if you don't trust your politicians and institutions, you don't trust in democracy anymore. And that's the goal of these multiple disinformation campaigns. We haven't seen AI being used to spread massively content. But on the other hand, the way we talk about AI, and especially in the framework of disinformation, creates doubts for everyone. Disinformation lays the ground for war. The war in Ukraine by Russia arrived with disinformation, and we saw what's happening in the Middle East, and we're like, maybe legal shaking can help.
Hey everyone, welcome to Bites of Ingenuity. That was Vincent Couronne, co-founder of French fact-checking organisation Les Surligneurs and treasurer of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network. I'm Nick Newsom, and on today's episode, Vincent and I discuss the evolving nature of disinformation tactics, particularly those observed around the recent EU elections, and how fact-checkers are responding. We also explore how fact-checkers are using AI to accelerate the formation of fact-checking units in conflict-prone areas, and we discuss why fact-checkers think platforms should be doing more to curb the spread of harmful content online. Let's get to it. Thanks, Vincent, for joining us today. And you've just come in from Sarajevo and the Global Fact-Checking Summit, the largest annual gathering of fact-checkers internationally. It's a pleasure to host you on Bites of Ingenuity. To kick off the show, I thought you could give us a few key takeaways from GlobalFact 11. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, a lot of things, I would say, because GlobalFact, it's during 3-4 days, hundreds of journalists all around the world who come and gather at one place to discuss all the issues about fact-checking, disinformation, manipulation of information, propaganda, and all these matters, all these things. So, there's a lot to say, but I would say that first of all, what happened in Sarajevo is what happens every year, once a year with fact-checkers, is that we all realize when we gather all together that we face the same kind of threats and issues everywhere around the world. And it's always good for us to meet and just remind this all together. And the other thing is, fact-checkers have relationships with platforms, digital platforms like Meta, Google, TikTok, etc. And these platforms are also here at GlobalFact. And it was very interesting to see that this time platforms didn't have a good time, I think, because fact-checkers were very harsh on the platforms for not fighting enough against disinformation. And last thing I would say about Sarajevo this year is that it was, and I think that everyone's felt this way. It was very symbolic for all these journalists to be in Sarajevo, a city which was the theater of a siege during years with thousands of people who died, and the role of the international press, which was very big during this siege. And so there was a kind of also remembering what is it to be a journalist in war times, when nationalism, populism, and fanaticism, also religious fanaticism, is at stake. And I think that with the times we're living now and where we're going, I'm not very optimistic about what's going to happen in the coming years. I think it's good for journalists to remember what it is to live in such a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. A very profound place to be. And also, I'm looking forward to touching on that sort of tortured relationship between fact-checkers and platforms who obviously have a big role to play in the health of our online information environment. So obviously the EU elections have just passed, and you're a treasurer of the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, which has been building a collaborative database gathering fact checks around the elections. And I know that before the elections, there was a lot of worry and anxiety that there would be a wave of narratives questioning the legitimacy of the European elections.
The Kremlin wants a vote in European elections.
A surge of disinformation in the run-up to next month's European election.
Ahead of the vote, EU leaders and the European Union are increasingly being the targets of misinformation.
And the goal? Well, simple: to confuse voters, sow distrust and doubt and division about the election process and about democracy itself.
Has this wave of narratives materialized, and what kind of disinformation was observed?
Yeah, first of all, we, as European fact-checkers, we all prepared for the EU elections because we knew there would be a lot of disinformation circulating. And the first thing is that we learned is that actually there was not much disinformation directly targeting the EU elections. But what we saw is that the disinformation was much more complex, elaborate, or thought the way it was spread. For example, if you look at the farmers' protest that we had everywhere in Europe for the EU elections. These protests were not exactly, they were not about the EU elections. That was about the cost of living of the farmers, about the business model of the farmers, and plenty of other things, the European Green Deal. But we could see narratives spread, especially from Russia, but not just from Russia. Probably the biggest player in this area, but not the only one. You also have China and other countries spreading narratives throughout farmers against the EU and EU politics or public policies. And so we could see that actually disinformation during these EU elections were not about the EU elections themselves, but it was about, giving less credits to the EU institutions. And these were the narratives which were pushed and spread by foreign interference, for example.
Okay, so they're piggybacking on divisive issues at the national level to sow further division and sort of resentment or discontent towards the EU and EU institutions, rather than questioning the legitimacy of the EU elections themselves or trying to discredit certain politicians.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about using local fractures, local issues, and to use these issues against EU politics or against EU institutions.
And why would you say that they've used this as a method rather than creating disinformation about politicians or fabricating it from scratch?
Because what we see mostly in foreign interference is that foreign countries are not going to fabricate disinformation and then spread it. And that is what is new during this campaign. They use already existing disinformation, local disinformation, which is created by local politicians, local fake accounts on social media. They take this and they spread it. While before, in the past years, they used to create their own disinformation and try to spread it. But you cannot know exactly how the culture, the local culture, humor, history, references work. So let the local people do it and then spread it. It's much more efficient. One thing that, although we could see which was created by Russia mostly, was disinformation about, tags on the walls in Europe. Graffitis, yes. Graffitis everywhere in Europe that we could see with, for example, David stars or with bloody hands or the head of Macron just cut off or the head of Zelensky just cut off. And that kind of thing which are meant to bring doubts towards the European citizens about what's happening in Ukraine and the fact that Europe is going to lose the war, for example, or that Europeans are anti-Semitic, or that kind of thing. These were creations from, in most of these cases, Russia or Russian agents, and spread by Russia. And it worked quite well in some occasions.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, how effective have these disinformation campaigns been? And you've mentioned that it's a sort of evolution of tactics. They're becoming more sophisticated, perhaps, in the sense that they're picking up on local networks and using locally legitimate figures who have aired grievances and kind of twisting them, inserting a new narrative. It sounds more advanced and effective. Has it been?
Well, it's not always very effective. One disinformation campaign is not effective. You cannot tell that because you're going to have David stars painted on walls in Paris one night and then spread out on social media, that the people and the world is going to think that France and all the French are anti-Semitic, and there is an issue with that. And of course, there is anti-Semitism. I'm not saying the opposite, and which is very serious. But they are trying to push this narrative. And this one single campaign was not efficient. What is efficient is to add dozens and dozens of campaigns like this, and multiple types of campaigns. And then you create a kind of informational environment where everything is mixed up. You do not really believe anymore the contents you see, and you have doubts on the reality or the veracity of a content, an image, a video, a text, something. And just people in the end don't believe anymore or don't trust anymore in the news, for example, or on what they see on social media. And if you don't trust the news anymore, you don't trust your politicians anymore. And if you don't trust your politicians and the institutions, you don't trust in democracy anymore. And that's the goal of these multiple disinformation campaigns.
So creating a critical mass of false narratives that then make it possible for people to question everything and sort of not even trust legitimate, trustworthy news outlets.
Yeah, because when we see, for example, the challenges of AI today, we can see that you can create very quickly content with AI, and which is a fake content. But the good news is, if I can say that, the good news is that AI is very good at creating content, but not so good at spreading the content at like a very large scale. And So far, we haven't seen AI being used to spread massively content. But on the other hand, because there is this speed around AI-generated disinformation, and everyone talks about AI-generated disinformation, you have these general doubts being created amongst the population that everything they see might be AI-generated disinformation, while in most of the cases, it is not. It is real. That's a real photo of a massacre in Gaza, for example. That's a real photo of a wounded soldier in Ukraine. And that's the thing. AI today and the way we talk about AI, and especially in the framework of disinformation, creates doubts for everyone.
Yeah, it's tricky times. I'm wondering, when it comes to generative AI, deepfakes, having observed the European elections for the previous few months and spotted these kind of examples of deepfakes and other AI-generated content or misinformation, how would you kind of classify the overall tone of it? Has it been malicious, or has it been satirical or jokey? Because I was reading an article in Rest of World a month or two back, and they were looking at the Indian elections, and they said that in that context, most of the uses of generative AI or deepfakes had been kind of jokey or light-hearted. Is that the same in the European context, or has it been more malicious?
I would say that it's been more malicious, because when it wasn't malicious, when it's jokey, I would not consider it as disinformation. This is a caricature, or this is sarcasm, that's humor, I hope people understand it. But we saw some malicious AI-generated disinformation circulating, which again, alone didn't have a big impact. But if you just add them all together, it creates this doubt. This society of doubt, where everyone doubts.
And with the disinformation actors changing their tactics, tapping into local networks and seeding their narratives there, and generative AI coming to the fore, as fact checkers, have you had to respond differently to this and maybe change your own tactics or change the way you fact check? Is it maybe you need to do more pre-bunking or other forms of fact checking?
It's something our work has changed because of AI, that's for sure, but not so much. What I mean is, on a daily basis, we don't see that much disinformation generated with AI. What we see every day, it's posts on social media, it's claims from politicians or public figures. That is, I would say, 95% of the time what we debunk. From time to time, you have AI, a video, a photo, a text with what they use, which is quite clever actually, what we call copy pasta. It's not a copy paste, it's a copy paste with slight differences. So you will copy paste the same text from multiple websites and posts on social media, but we just have slight changes so that AI tools to detect that kind of AI copy paste, won't be detected. So that's what we call copy pasta. But anyway, so we see that kind of thing, but it's pretty rare actually. It's not the heart of our work. So what changed in our work is mostly to be able to detect AI generated disinformation. And for now, it's not so difficult, because when you see a deepfake, yes, it is amazing to see how a deepfake can be so easily made, but it's very easy to debunk it, actually. On most of the cases, you see that it's made by AI. Or if you don't see it, it's very easy to find out the source and how it was built and other things. So for the time being, AI didn't change much the way we work. AI, on the other side, changed the way we fight against disinformation, because we want to be able to use AI against AI. And that's something that we might talk about later.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you're here with me today, Vincent, in Beirut, and thank you for coming at this time when it's quite tense in the country with war in the south of the country. So your work obviously becomes more important in conflict situations where there's heightened tension and attempts to control the narrative around what's going on. And Les Surligneurs is known for legal checking. And I've not come across other organizations doing legal checking or that have a distinct methodology for it. And they're usually talking about fact checking more generally. What is legal checking, for one thing? And why is it helpful to make this distinction between legal checking and fact-checking?
Legal checking is a type of fact-checking. It's a branch of fact-checking. So when we created the concept of legal checking at Les Surligneurs, that was 7 years ago, we knew we were not the first one to do legal checking. And other media outlets, other fact-checkers, from time to time, they also do legal checking. They just didn't know it. They hadn't never conceptualized it. And what we did is to create a methodology specifically for this legal fact-checking to say that, okay, if you want to fact check, for example, climate disinformation, you're going to reach out to climate scientists, and you know what kind of scientists you're going to reach. You're going to reach leading scientists on the field who have published renowned works on the etc. If you want to fact check legal disinformation, who do you call? Usually, journalists call lawyers, barristers, practitioner lawyers, and for us, it's a problem because usually these lawyers, they have conflicts of interest. They have clients, they have interest. So we will always be suspicious about their answer. Is it objective or is it biased? So what we do is that we learn how to find a way to select law specialists who have no conflict of interest and also who are specialists in the field of the law. And that is something that we build it. It's a whole methodology to say, for example, the law can be interpreted in some occasions, not always, but in many occasions, actually, you can interpret the law. There's room for interpretation. So what do you do in that case? If you are a journalist, you know nothing about the law, you're going to call a lawyer who is going to give you his interpretation of the law, and you're going to write your paper with that. Or you're going to call a second lawyer to have a second opinion. And maybe they will have a conflicting opinion. But what you do not know as a journalist usually is which opinion is better than the other. And better, I mean, not there is one that I prefer than the other, but there is one of the opinions, one of the two, which is much more shared by the legal community than the other one. So you need to make this difference. And we create a methodology to make sure that our readers, they know when we tell them this is an interpretation of the law, but that's the majority. The majority thinks that and the minority thinks that. And it's not easy, actually, because the law is very flexible. Climate is not. Biology is not. But the law, it is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it kind of reminds me a bit about COVID as well, when there's not a great deal of scientific evidence about an emerging issue, COVID, for example, and you would go to one epidemiologist and go to another, and they have different views. And I remember at the time, one of the best practices was to report on, well, you admit that there's an uncertainty, but you identify where the emerging consensus is. Is that a similar sort of analogy or comparison?
Completely. And I think all of us as journalists, we learned about COVID, not to put forward a scientist who is going to say something completely different from the others if the scientist is completely ignored by the community. I mean, we try also to create now a better hierarchy between the scientific opinions from the scientist. And not all the scientific opinions have the same value.
Right, yeah, no point platforming fringe scientific theories that haven't been peer-reviewed or don't have the consensus. Are you, when you're trying to understand where the consensus lies, are you building a network or a database of lawyers? And how did you go about doing that?
We know that because we work mostly with law researchers, legal researchers, academics, scholars. And when you do research in law, you know what are the consensus in different subjects. So that's something which is part of your education as a researcher. So you are going to, when you're going to reach a specialist, you know in which consensus or outside of the consensus he is. And that is something which is useful. That's a knowledge that the regular jurists, or for example, or lawyers don't have. So it's very valuable kind of knowledge.
As fact checkers, as legal checkers, are you going to the source text yourself and looking at the international humanitarian law, whatever it might be, national law, or are you mainly resorting to these vetted experts, you might call them?
We do both. So we try to find ourselves the answer first and going to the sources, legal sources, but we also contact, of course, law specialists so that they can confirm or they can also proofread our papers, our articles, and confirm what we write and all the things. For example, if you want to write a paper about is Netanyahu liable before the International Criminal Court, Joe Biden says no, the International Criminal Criminal Court doesn't have any power, any jurisdiction over Israel and Netanyahu to launch international warrant arrest. But if you look at the Statute of Rome, which created the International Criminal Court, it says the opposite. So you just go into this text and you make sure that you reach to lawyers, to international lawyers, and you ask them, do you agree or not? And then if yes, if there is a consensus on the interpretation of this text, then you publish your article. And no big surprise, but what we found out is that Netanyahu is liable before the International Criminal Court.
So when you're going to the source materials, if you don't have a legal background, you wouldn't necessarily know where to look, and legal research can take quite a long time. What did you see as the sort of main pain points in actually carrying out the first step of this legal research and identifying the relevant legislation to be able to legal check a claim?
In most of the times, it's quite almost impossible to find the sources because they are buried in obscure websites, official databases, which are not very user-friendly. And the law usually is not written in a way which is user-friendly. So what you do at the moment is, you're a journalist, you call us. You call Les Surligneurs and you ask for expertise, the legal experts from Les Surligneurs. But we're building a tool with Siren, which is meant to help journalists to find by themselves the first sources, relevant sources, before they even call an expert. The idea of the tool that we are building is that you enter your claim or your question in the tool and it gives you relevant sources in international law so far. And then you can see which kind of sources have to be mobilized and dealt with. And then you can call an expert because you already have a basic knowledge about the situation. You call expert and you ask the right questions. So it also helps you to choose your subject. Is it relevant to write an article about that? And also it helps you not being alone, I would say. When you talk to an expert, you don't let the expert telling you anything without you controlling or checking what he says.
So it's a chatbot that you would enter a claim, the Netanyahu one, for example, and it would then come back with a summary and sort of the relevant legal texts to be able to guide you in putting an article together before you go to an expert.
Exactly. If you put a claim in the tool saying Netanyahu is not liable before the International Criminal Court, it will answer false and gives you the reason why it is false with AI-generated text, and then give you all the sources. And Article 12 of the Statute of Rome, for example.
Okay, nice. So have you had a chance to use this chatbot, this AI chatbot, in your day-to-day work yet? And sort of how much time would it save in writing a typical article? It's
hard to say now because we haven't used it in our newsroom for now. What we did is that no later than this morning, we tested it. It's been tested before by Siren, but this morning we had like a large-scale testing of the tool and we played with it. We entered a lot of claims and looked at the answers, and it was very exciting to see all these very relevant results we had because the Siren team did just a great job in fine-tuning the tool. And of course, we're still in a beta phase, so we had to do some feedbacks and say, okay, it would be better to have this source displayed after this paragraph, or to have this answer written rather like this, or you try to understand why didn't the tool see this international convention while it is the core text which should be used. So we're just repairing all the things to really fine-tune the AI and make sure that in a few weeks it's completely reliable.
So there's a process of tuning it where the outcomes are being audited by legal scholars, and it can then produce better results after being adjusted. At the moment, I understand you're training it on international humanitarian law. Why is it that you've started there? And where do you see it going next?
Well, the idea, when we wanted to work with Siren on this project, the idea was to set up a legal checking operation in Lebanon and to make it easy for legal checkers in Lebanon to write articles and publish them quickly and easily. So for us, AI was the key to this challenge. Why international humanitarian law? Because of the situation in the Middle East. And we can see that, as you said before, there is conflict in the south. This region is very unstable at the moment, and bad things could happen, clearly. And we know because we saw how the war in Ukraine by Russia arrived with disinformation coming before. So you have disinformation first and then the war. So you can see that disinformation lays the ground for the war. usually. And we saw what's happening in the Middle East, and we were like, maybe legal checking can help. Not to fight against the war, but to prepare resilience also from the population and the citizens in that kind of situation. So that is why we focused on the international humanitarian law specifically. And for the future of the tool, I don't know if I can tell. I don't know if I'm allowed to tell, but I think the idea is because we see now that it works with international humanitarian law, then why not going further, to implement it with other types of laws. I won't say more than that.
So we covered a bit about AI, disinformation, and how you're dealing with it as a fact checker, as a legal checker. There's been some regulation around AI and how to handle deepfakes. What's your take on the EU AI Act, and how far will it go in reducing that load?
Well, the EU AI Act could be very powerful. It's been adopted by the European Parliament and the EU Council, but it's not enforced yet. It will enter into force in a year and a half. So it's going to take time before we can see the results of this act. But it can be very powerful because the concept of the AI Act is to create a scale of the dangerosity of AI, and the most dangerous AI content are banned in the EU. Then you have another category of dangerous AI, which is not the most dangerous, and then it has to be labeled, regulated. The source has to be open. The way the machine has been trained has to be open and to the public, and plenty of things like this. Transparency on how did you train your machine to build this image or this video or that kind of thing. And then you have like regular AI with no significant impact on citizenship, on elections, on health, on people, and then it's fine. You don't need to label it, and it's okay because there's no danger for the population. So I think it's quite a good approach to make a difference between categories of AI and the risks this AI create. And is it going to change things? Probably. But in order to know whether or not it's going to change things, we should know first, is AI-generated content going to be a game changer at all in our daily life? And for now, we can see it changes things, but we don't know how far it's going to change things. So are we going to be flooded with AI-generated content like every day, personalized AI-generated content, or not? And as long as we do not have this answer, I don't know if the AI Act would be helpful or not.
Right, so we need to monitor it and watch where this develops, and then potentially tweak the law accordingly. You mentioned earlier a bit about the relationship between fact checkers and platforms, and another important element of this debate and what constitutes a healthy or unhealthy media environment is the way that media platforms sort of promote certain types of content. And at the moment, it seems that they're not very much incentivized to promote healthy dialogue. In our attention economy, platforms are rewarded for boosting content that generates strong emotions, which increases the time people spend on platforms, which enables them to gather more data about these users and then sell more individualized ads to them. So there's this incentive structure there for them not really to change, because their whole business model is about generating engagement. And at the moment, it seems like pushing content that is sensational or generates strong emotions is the best way for them to do that. And obviously, fact-based content doesn't stand a chance in this environment. So that's a huge problem. And it's a funny one as well, because at the same time, platforms, they're paying fact-checking groups to flag content through the third-party fact-checking program, so that they add warning labels and downrank the harmful content that has quite possibly been trending because of their algorithm or recommendation system. Yeah, it feels a bit like kind of logging company symbolically planting a sapling after felling 100 trees, So I'm curious, how do you feel your job and fact-checking more broadly would change if the platforms adjusted their algorithms so they weren't actively pushing sensationalist content, which might not necessarily be false, to users?
I think your image was right. It's clearly the platforms are part of the problem of disinformation. And if they were not there, I mean, who knows where we would be, all of us. But today, clearly, we can tell that disinformation circulates mostly on platforms. Now that we know that, we have a problem because disinformation is not illegal content. Promotion of terrorism, hate speech, that kind of thing is illegal content, not disinformation. So how do you do to regulate disinformation when it's part of the freedom of speech? So that's what the DSA, the Digital Services Act, tried to address, that kind of issue. Because if you do not say that disinformation is illegal, then how do you regulate it? And the option was chosen by the EU was to say, okay, disinformation is still legal content. Disinformation is still legal content. It's still legal to spread fake news. But because of this business model of the platforms that where disinformation creates more turnout than true information. I mean, there is this old study from the MIT which found that fake news spread 6 times faster than true news on Twitter. Well, it was in 2016. We probably should update this research, this paper. But anyway, we can see that disinformation creates more money for the platforms. So the EU said, we're going to let you spread disinformation if you want, but you have to make sure that you mitigate the risks that your services, your algorithms, for example, your moderation policy, you have to mitigate the risks that your services create against health, the integrity of elections, fundamental rights, gender equality. And when disinformation creates that kind of risk, then you have to mitigate the risk. You have to make sure that your algorithm, put differently, it's a bit technical because that's the EU regulation, but anyway, put it differently, platforms have to make sure that their algorithms and their moderation policy does not encourage the spread of disinformation. And if they do not make sure that their services don't facilitate the spread of disinformation, they can be fined. And this is illegal. It is illegal now not to pay attention to the spread of disinformation on platforms. And it's a big change, philosophically, economically also for the platforms. And fact checkers have been working with platforms for years now to reduce the visibility of disinformation content without deleting it. Because we are journalists, I mean, we don't work for less information. We work for more information. So what we want to do is when there is disinformation on a platform, we just tag it and we tell the platform and we say, look, Facebook, here, this post, this is disinformation, you should take care of it. So there is this relationship which has been created between platforms and fact checkers. But in the European Union, this work relationship is different because of the DSA, fact checkers play a role in reducing disinformation on platforms. And so we have a kind of, the DSA in the EU, how to explain that, gives the fact checker enough independence towards the platforms to tell the platforms what's wrong and to say it like very bluntly if we have to. And Sarajevo was a good example of this. They really, I think, didn't have a good time, especially TikTok, YouTube, but also Meta. They have been highly criticized and mostly by European fact checkers because the DSA allows the fact checker to be that independent from the platforms. So that is something which I find very healthy, that we can work with the platforms to reduce the visibility of disinformation, but at the same time, we can still criticize them if they do not enough to fight against disinformation.
So the DSA creates pressure on platforms to at least not promote the kind of more sensationalist, harmful content, and is also not forcing platforms into that difficult space where they're the ones having to decide what gets flagged or not, or what's deemed disinformation or not. And there's a mechanism for them to change their recommendation systems, how certain content gets presented to people. And there's also measures for researchers, I understand, to also examine the algorithms and also like the way they target ads at certain people.
Yeah, these are audits which are being conducted right now, actually, and we will have the reports probably in November to see how the algorithms target specific types of people, categories, do they spread disinformation or not. This is going to be very helpful and useful. All these reports will be published and made public. Very interesting things if you wait until November to read.
So this is something we can expect Surligneurs to do a deep dive into.
Sure, and not only the Surligneurs, but also the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, whose role is to do that kind of work and to dive into that kind of reports and to tell the people what's wrong in how the platforms work.
I've been reading a bit about some of the commentary around the DSA, the Digital Services Act. The DSA Observatory at the University of Amsterdam is one where they've looked into how much muscle it has, I suppose. And they've noted it's often quite soft. It doesn't fully empower the EU to force the platforms to turn off their recommender systems at certain times, as some MEPs have recently suggested. And in the DSA, it's not really clear exactly what specific measures platforms should take. Instead, they should sign up to the semi-voluntary strengthened code of practice on disinformation, which is meant for them to as a way to demonstrate their compliance with the DSA. So it's a somewhat complicated system, but some would say not strong enough and not muscular enough in being able to force big tech to change. At the same time, we'd see that the big tech doesn't seem to have much interest in changing itself. There's things like the dismantling of the trust and safety teams at Meta and X, research groups flagging the continued running of propaganda ads, and Meta replacing its prime tool for researchers to track the spread of disinformation. This is CrowdTangle, and sort of replacing it with what some groups have said is a tool that's not fit for purpose yet. So if the commentators are saying the DSA is not muscular enough, do you think that there are other policy levers that could be pulled in order to change that incentive structure around the business model, basically?
I think changing the business model of the platforms is a bit ambitious, but the DSA can help curving a bit their business model. And the DSA, it's hard law. It's a EU legal norm which is binding for the platforms. But the DSA is still very general. It speaks in very general terms and doesn't have very detailed measures, as you said, on how to fight against disinformation. So that is why there is this code of practice on disinformation, which is this semi-voluntary, as you said, text code that the platforms and fact checkers, they sign and they commit to respect, to implement. And I think it's not a good idea. I think that voluntary code of conduct like this, which is what we call soft law, is not enough if you want to have an efficient policy, especially against disinformation, which is something so big that we need urgent and efficient action. And we can see that even with a code which is voluntary, we can see that the platforms are very reluctant in implementing this code. I mean, there is, for example, one of the signatories is Meta. Meta is probably, it is the platforms which makes the most against disinformation, but also because it's big. I mean, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, Thread, WhatsApp. So it's a big company, but they put a lot of efforts in fighting against disinformation, even though what they do is far from being enough, but clearly they do like 1,000 times more than the others, especially TikTok, which does not so many things. YouTube does almost nothing, and it's a disaster situation of disinformation on YouTube, and let alone X and all these people. But they are signatories of the code. Not X, but TikTok, YouTube, they sign the code, but they don't really implement it. And even though they don't really implement it, they're trying to make sure that the code will never be stronger as it is today. So at one point, the political power should say, this is the rule, now you respect the rules. You have to fight against disinformation because it's in the DSA. If you don't, you get fined, and like heavy fined. And for now, I'm afraid that there isn't enough legal constraint towards that.
Yeah, time will tell, really, whether the DSA proves to be strong enough and whether platforms really do hold up their end of the bargain or what they've signed up to. And you mentioned that the DSA does set an important kind of bar around norm setting and codifying what is acceptable or not, establishing a norm that it's not okay to promote certain types of content, and it would be beneficial if more fact-based content or reporting was being promoted instead. Alongside that, also, you need norms in society to change and for people to also reject when they're scrolling on Instagram or on Facebook, to reject the sensationalist, biased or hateful media. Yeah, there's this interesting interplay between creators, platforms and their audiences, all influencing each other and the kinds of content that they produce. Like an influencer might start changing the type of content that they produce in order to game the algorithm or optimize the performance, or in order to tap into a new audience based on the engagement they get. And I think René de Rester, who was the former research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, has written a bit about this. And that's an interesting story to follow. I don't know if you've been following it over the last few weeks, but that's an aside, how the SIO is being shut down or changed.
Yeah, that's a very sad story. And I hope that it's not a thing that we will see soon in Europe. To shut down a research center because of political pressure, I think it's a disaster for freedom of research and expression and just the well-being of our societies. I mean, where are we? I mean, to do that kind of thing. And who are we to accept that? Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about how Europe is going to evolve in the next years.
Yeah, there's this pushback against fact-checkers and against the so-called censorship industrial complex, which is a kind of theory based on fairly spurious accusations that fact-checkers are stifling free speech, and particular conservative speech online, and pressuring platforms to take down that speech. And that's the kind of, I guess, backdrop to this story of the Stanford Internet Observatory being shut down, and then lawmakers subpoenaing them and investigating based on these spurious claims. I guess this is a bit of an aside, and what I wanted to kind of probe or explore a bit further was, with fact-checking being part of the equation of promoting fact-based discourse, but between public media literacy, changing recommendation algorithms and fact-checking, where do you see fact-checking's role in building a network of resistance against disinformation? And is your work geared more towards researchers, civil society organizations, other fact-checkers, journalists, or do you see yourselves targeting the average Joe, your average newsreader?
Good question. I think the future of fact-checking is collaboration with researchers, but also with media literacy organizations to make sure that the work we do is always at the state of the art of the research and what we know about the effect, the impact of fact-checking, the impact of disinformation, so that we always do a work which is impactful, but also which does not replace people having a critical thinking and does not tell them what to think. Working with a lot of fact checkers across the world, and especially in Europe, that's something that I hear all the time. We do not censor content. We just bring additional information. When a politician, when a post on the social media says something, we say, look, actually, there are facts which do not completely align with what is being said. You can believe what you think, what you want, but just read also what we have to say about that and read the facts. This is not censorship. This is what journalists do every day, bringing facts to the audience. And we want to make sure that fact-checking always evolves in a way which is helpful for the community and for the society and doesn't have any negative impact or counterproductive impact. We know, for example, that if you read a fact check which comes from a media outlets which you don't like, you will not believe in the fact check. If you read the exact same fact check in a newspaper which you like, you will believe in the fact check. So it's not about, for the people who read your fact check, it's not about accepting the facts or the proof. It's also about our bias when we are readers. Do we believe facts or not? It depends on who spreads the facts. And that is something that we take into account to also see who is our audience. Who do we talk to? For example, at Les Surligneurs, we do legal checking. Legal checking is easy to make. It's something which is easy to do if you have the good law academics in your team. But this is something which is complex to understand if you're not a lawyer, if you're not a law specialist. So we found out that our audience were not the general public. They were mostly journalists. So we know that we talk to journalists from left media outlets to conservative, even far-right media outlets who read us as well. So we write for them and we try to make sure that they understand the facts and the law when they have to cover the news and all the things. And we do that because we work closely with researchers specialized in the fight against disinformation or specialized into the spread of disinformation. And they tell us how does information work, how bias work, how does the audience react to what you write. And that's the way we improve ourselves every day and make our work more efficient, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think just to mention, you know, who delivers the fact check is as important as the fact check itself almost. And in order to counter things like accusations of a censorship industrial complex. That's why you have things like the Code of Ethics for fact-checking groups, right, which is part of the European fact-checking standards network.
Yeah, that's the Code of Ethics we have. It is in this European association where if you want to be a certified fact-checker, you have to abide by this Code of Ethics. And to make sure that you abide by this Code of Ethics, which deals with independence, objectivity, pluralism of the subject and the ideas you share, and impartiality as well, and the methodology. If you want to be certified and to make sure that you respect this code of ethics, you have to go through a double external independent audit. So, for example, at Les Surligneurs, we've been audited twice by 2 external auditors who dived into all our publications, all our fact checks and see, okay, what's the method? Do they respect the code of ethics? Who are the journalists who write the articles? Do they have any conflicts of interest and all the things? Who owns Les Surligneurs? Is it paid by big companies like big industrial billionaires or that kind of thing, or by politicians who want to influence the news or not? So everything is monitored, looked, and if you're okay, you're certified and you're considered as an independent fact checker. And so far, we have 50 media outlets in Europe who are members of this association and who are certified fact checkers.
Amazing. So would you say the work is still growing? Is the movement towards more fact checkers building?
Yeah, there are not more and more fact checkers in the world, to be honest. There was a time when fact checkers were being created everywhere in the world. Now it's being less the case. I think that it's more like there's a kind of plateau, But in the European Union, we still have a lot of fact-checking organizations who did not join the European Fact-Checking Standards Network, and we are doing our best, and me as well as a member of the board of this organization, to help these media outlets to be independent, impartial, objective, and to be able to join this association. Because we think that it is our role to make sure that the fact checkers do a good job and are certified, because that is what brings trust from the audience.
So it's in a consolidation and professionalization phase.
Completely, exactly, yeah. And I think it's necessary.
Yeah, so I've really enjoyed this deep dive into the fact-checking world and geeking out on regulating platforms and how we promote a more healthy media environment online. I guess to wrap up, I would like to ask, what is the most surprising or bizarre fact check or piece of disinformation you've come across, and how did you debunk it?
There are so many that I cannot even pick one. I have a lot of examples, but which might sound a bit boring for your audience, I think, because it's very French. But anyway, we have a politician in France who is not very popular amongst the constituency, the citizens, but quite popular on social media. So he got followers, but not people, not voters, really. And he's quite influential on social media as well. And one day he said, look, the government just passed a decree which says that now you're not allowed anymore to use the water from the rain. If it rains in your garden, you're not allowed anymore to use it for gardening or that kind of thing. You have to let the rain going in the earth because that's the way it is now. And you're like, what?
What is the incentive for giving this piece of information?
So we had, of course, to debunk this stupid thing and say, of course, that's not what the decree says, and you can still use the water from the rain to water your garden if you want, or to do other things with it. But we could see that behind this post was so popular on social media, we could see that thousands of social media accounts and bots retweeted it and shared it, and most of them came from Russian accounts. And so you can tell that, that's the example I gave at the beginning. It's not Russian-created disinformation. It's been created by a very French politician, but then it is being pushed by foreign interference.
That's a bizarre example. Was he just spouting nonsense, or was it geared towards saying, the EU environmental legislation is wrong or something like that?
Yeah, I think the narrative is to say that the government and especially the EU is trying to ruin our lives and to make everything more complicated, and we should exit from the EU, or we should exit for any environmental regulation and all that kind of thing. And in a way, when you add all these narratives, it works a little bit. I mean, we have elections which show that.
Absolutely. Well, we've seemed to have gone full circle in our episode from reporting on what was happening at the EU elections round to a very tangible example there of just how foreign actors will piggyback on spurious claims and insert their narrative. And I think that's a nice point to wrap up. So thanks very much for coming on, Vincent, and look forward to tracking your work in the future and hearing further about how the new tool helps.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting me.